To understand the gallows of Tenerife in 1504, we first have to wash away the blood of 1488. It all began on La Gomera, an island that refused to bow its head. The clans of Ipalan and Mulagua did what every oppressed people pushed beyond the limit eventually understands. They struck down their executioner. The cruel lord, Hernán Peraza, was killed. For the Spaniards, this was high treason. For freedom, it was an act of justice, but colonial revenge knows no limits. Pedro de Vera landed with his troops. Beatriz de Bobadilla demanded blood, and the order was given: a systematic massacre of all men over the age of 15. The survivors, mutilated, the women and children, hunted like cattle. This was not simply a defeat, it was uprooting. Thousands of Gomeros were thrown into the holds of ships. Their destination was slavery, exile, or disappearance. And it was this traumatized memory, this broken people, that would end up only a few years later crowded into Tenerife, in a cursed street. To understand the hypocrisy of what would happen next in Tenerife, we have to look at how the Spanish crown dealt with La Gomera. Officially, the Gomeros were considered Christians and submitted before the rebellion. Spanish law forbade the enslavement of Christian subjects, but colonial bureaucracy always finds a way. To justify the massacre and the sale of the survivors, Pedro de Vera and Beatriz de Bobadilla declared the rebels to be apostates and traitors. With a single stroke of the pen, thousands of human beings lost their rights. They became legal merchandise, bodies for the slave markets of Seville, bodies for the rest of the archipelago. This is where the man appears who would forever bind the fate of La Gomera to the fate of Tenerife, Alonso Fernández de Lugo. At that moment, Lugo was preparing the conquest of Tenerife, the last rebellious island. And war is expensive, very expensive. So how did he finance his soldiers and his weapons? By involving himself directly in the trafficking of Gomero captives. But he also made a military calculation. He forcibly recruited survivors from La Gomera and turned them into indios auxiliares, indigenous auxiliary troops forced to fight against other indigenous people. That is how empire works. You break a people and then you force them to help break their neighbors. Tenerife fell too. Alonso Fernández de Lugo won his war, partly with the blood of the Gomeros he had forced to march beside him. But once the war was over, what happened to the survivors? What happened to those forced allies? What happened to the Guanches who survived the massacre? Lugo had promised them land. He had promised them freedom. But the reality was different. They had no right to anything. They passed from being tools of war to becoming the waste of colonial society, useful during conquest, disposable after victory. They were confined in La Laguna, the new capital. And in La Laguna, one street would carry their name, Calle de los Gomeros. The street of the Gomeros. That is where the trap would close. No boats to escape, forbidden to leave. And for anyone who dared to help the fugitives, prison, confiscation, or death. This is not only a story of conquest, it is a story of how a people can be used, displaced, renamed, confined, and then buried under silence. The Gomeros of Tenerife were not a legend. They were not a footnote. They were survivors of La Gomera, forced into the machinery of conquest, then abandoned inside the new colonial order, and the street remembered what the official chronicles tried to erase. In part 2, we will read between the lines of the Cabildo records of 1504. We will follow the orders, the prohibitions, the punishments, and we will face the gallows of Tenerife.